I am the Greenwich Society Events Committee new chair, having taken over from Jackie Hicks. And I first heard Nick Draper talk for the Women's Institute in Lee in March 2021, when we were just in lockdown and we were all doing lots and lots of Zooms. But Nick's talk really stood out for me. And I remember the weeks afterward, I was forever talking to my friends about, you know, what Nick had talked about, because it was just so thought-provoking and something I had never really thought about it. And I am Dutch, and equally the Dutch and the English were equally making a lot of money out of slavery, and it was never mentioned. You know, when I was at school in Holland, people never talked about slavery. So it is really good to have Nick's talk. And then I was also talking to a friend of mine who recently graduated in history, and she reminded me, and presumably lots of you know it, J.P. Hartley's quote, and it goes like, "The past is a foreign country, they do things different there." And I think that's exactly sums up how we've all moved on, really. So yes, I'm really pleased that Nick is talking to us, and I hope you will enjoy it as much as I did almost a year ago. I shall just quickly read the introduction to Nick's in the email, so that you just know where Nick has come from. It says, "Dr. Nick Draper has worked on British slave ownership for 15 years. He was the co-founder and the first director of the Center for the Study of the Legacies of British Slave Owners at UCL. He published a book, The Price of Emancipation, published by Cambridge University Press in 2010 actually, and he won the Royal Historical Whitfield Prize and was shortlisted for the Frederick Douglass Prize. The television series Britain's Forgotten Slave Owners that he made with the BBC in 2015 won a BAFTA. And prior to his work in academia, Nick was a banker in the city for 25 years. And I shall now hand over to Nick, and I hope you will find it as enjoyable and as interesting as I did about a year ago. Nick, over to you now.
Thank you very much, Halma, and thank you also to Jonathan for his help with this. And thank you to everybody who is online and is listening to this. I appreciate the opportunity to talk to you about work that, as Halma said, has been underway for some time at UCL. I should also say at the outset that while I and my colleagues, know a lot about slave ownership, we know less than some of the people on the call about Blackheath and Greenwich. And so one of the purposes of doing this is to connect with people who know more than we do about the local histories that are embedded in communities. And I hope that if there is information that you have that you want to share, you will be able to do that. It's very easy to contribute information to us. We're very open to receiving information. So, slave owners of Blackheath and Greenwich. Usually when we talk about Britain and slavery, we think about abolition. That's becoming a little less true, and I think in younger generations, but certainly for my generation, and I would say with respect probably the generation that most of us on this call belong to, what we associate primarily is between Britain and slavery is the fact that Britain abolished the slave trade in 1807. William Wilberforce, you think about David Cameron, a few years ago, went with a small island speech about Britain as a beacon of liberty, and he went straight to the abolition of the slave trade, saying, in fact, incorrectly, that Britain was the first nation to abolish the slave trade. The Danes, Denmark, bless them, were in fact ahead of us. But it's a very deeply embedded part of our national identity, and rightly so too. It's an important staging post. But why did we need abolition, and what were we abolishing? There have been 200 years of British involvement, entanglement, deep entanglement in slavery before we reached abolition of the slave trade in 1807. And that period of entanglement is also part of our history alongside abolition. What does it have to do with Blackheath and Greenwich? Well, as we go through, I hope that I'll begin to demonstrate a little bit how those connections were formed. I should say also an important thing at the outset, which is that chattel slavery was a colonial phenomenon. It existed in the American colonies, in the colonies of the Caribbean, in the colonies on mainland Latin America. But slavery never existed as a legal or social institution here in Britain. There were people of African descent who were in states of unfreedom in Britain. There's no doubt about that. We know that from newspaper advertisements for runaways. But as I say, as a social and legal institution, slavery was not in situ in Britain. So what I'm describing and talking about is a system that existed thousands of miles away. But that system came back, our argument is, to Britain in very many different ways, including through direct ownership of enslaved people, which is obviously what I'm going to try to delineate as we go forward. Helmer said at the outset, before the meeting began, to me that there'd been a recent important publication of a local history of Blackheath and Greenwich that made no reference to slave ownership, and the author said that he didn't think there had been slave owners in the area. And as I say, what we want to demonstrate is that simply cannot be true, and it was not true. So I'm going to start with some brief historical overview. For those of you who know this, bear with me and with the rest of the audience, but just to give you some sense for what is the historical context of what I'm describing. So here is a schematic, obviously, of the transatlantic slave trade over its entire course. And that entire course began with the Portuguese. Even before Columbus reached the Americas, the Portuguese had developed slave sugar complexes in their near Atlantic possessions in Madeira, in San Tome. And they had developed those by trading down the west coast of Africa and establishing, as I say, slave sugar complexes. Almost the first thing that the Spanish did after Columbus came back from the Americas to say what he'd found was to begin to ship enslaved Africans across. So the slave trade lasted, the transatlantic slave trade lasted from about 1510, the first shipments to the Americas, until final abolition. It was abolished by the Brazilians, the Portuguese and the Brazilians in the 1870s and 1880s. In that period, about 12.5 million people in total were shipped across the Atlantic. About 1 million of those died en route in the Middle Passage. Britain itself was a late but enthusiastic participant in this European project, and every European power was involved in slavery in some measure. The French, the Dutch very prominently, the Spanish, the Portuguese above all. So Britain was alongside its European rivals and peers. It started late. It was only really in the late 17th century with the royal monopoly, the Royal African Company. But then in the 18th century, Britain became the leading slave trading power, and shipped in the 18th century about 40% of the enslaved people who were moved across in the course of that 100 years. Trade began in London with the Royal African Company, then its centre shifted to Bristol, and then, of course, famously in the second half of the 18th century, Liverpool became the dominant slave trading port, not only in Britain, but in Europe. So what I've been describing up to now is the slave trade, and the enslaved people were being shipped, as you know, to European colonies in the Americas. And again, Britain began late in accumulating colonies in the Americas, but beginning with Jamestown in 1607, and then we took the Leeward Islands in the 1620s, settled in Barbados and the Leeward Islands, and then in the 1650s, under Cromwell, as part of his Western design, we seized Jamaica from the Spanish. There was then a second wave of expansion of our slave colonies in 1763 as part of one of the endless wars with France in the 18th century. In the settlement of 1763, we took from the French Grenada, St. Vincent, Dominica, and Tobago. And then there's a third big expansion of the slave empire, Britain's slave colonies, in the beginning of the 19th century, the very period when Britain was agonizing about the slave trade, it expanded its slave empire significantly by seizing from France and its allies at the end of the Napoleonic and Revolutionary Wars, British Guiana, Trinidad, St. Lucia, and then the Indian Ocean, Mauritius, and the Cape of Good Hope. All of those new accessions were really formalized in 1815 in the peace settlement after Napoleon's final defeat. So this period of colonial slavery for Britain between, let's say, 1620 and 1815 or so coincided, of course, with the Industrial Revolution. And there's controversy amongst historians as to what is the connection between those two things. It's polarized between those who say that slavery was irrelevant and others who say that Britain was built on the blood of slaves, that industrialization was driven by slavery, and particularly by the slave produce, sugar, tobacco, indigo, mahogany, and then, very important, of course, cotton. We don't need to resolve that debate today, but we can talk about it further in questions if you want. From the very outset of the slave trade and the slave system, there were voices in Britain and elsewhere speaking out against slavery as individual voices. By the 1760s, there was growing disquiet, I think because kind of the news about what slavery was beginning to circulate in the print, the new print culture in Britain. Local newspapers would carry accounts of rebellions and upheavals in the Caribbean that made it perfectly clear what levels of violence were embedded. As Britain became a more urban society, it became a more middle-class society. The middle class were seeking ways in which they could differentiate themselves from the aristocracy, whose values were really of violence and honor. And the middle class began to look towards duty and restraint as being rival qualities. And those urban centers became the centers of opposition to slavery. So Britain in 1807 abolished the slave trade. It was the second nation, as I say, after Denmark. It coincided more or less simultaneously with the Americans, the American former colonists, then an independent power, also abolishing the slave trade. And slavery itself was not abolished in Britain, in the British colonies, until the 1830s. So there was a long period of a quarter century in which hundreds of thousands of people were still held in captivity in the British colonies in the Caribbean. When Britain did finally free the enslaved people, it paid the slave owners compensation, £20 million in compensation. If you go back, I'm just going to go back to the cover slide for a moment. The cartoon that you see there, the man at the front is John Bull, standing for us, for Britain, and the man with the hat taking the £20 million out of his pocket is a planter, a slave owner. And that cartoon reflects the disquiet in Britain about the transaction in which what happened was that the state bought out the enslaved people from the slave owners. So a big payment at the end of slavery. That payment left records that we've now been able to look at and digitize. I'm going to show you a couple of slides here. The first you won't be able to read. Please don't worry about that. I'm going to show you a highlight in a moment. But I wanted to give you some sense for how orderly this structure is. You can see here, this is a modern bureaucracy as we look at these printed pages, and this records the names of slave owners and the compensation they received. In this case, it's for the island of St. Vincent. So if we go to the top of that page and look at, in more detail, at what those records show, this is the top level of the records, and you can see, I think, a number of different things from this. The first is that there is a difference of class, if you like. There are some slave owners who own, like Dennis O'Brien at the top of the page, 2 enslaved people, and then we can go down the page and see others who own hundreds of enslaved people, including Nathaniel Snell Chauncey, who owned an estate that had almost 700 enslaved people on it. So there are class differences, there are gender differences. You can see that 4 and 5 lines down, Eliza Littledale and then Charlotte Douglas, who received 2 separate awards. So women as slave owners as well as men, and we found that women represented almost 40% of the slave owners in the compensation records. Goodness. A very high number given property at that time was largely gendered, and that particularly husbands effectively expropriated their wives on marriage and became legally, they covered their wives' property. The third category, historical category that you can't see here, but which is present nevertheless, is race. All of the enslaved people were African. Almost all of the slave owners were white Europeans, but some were free people of color. And we now know that Eliza Littledale and Charlotte Douglas were slave owners, not atypical of a category of slave owner in the Caribbean. They were women of color, in other words, the product of either a white father or white grandfather, often a slave owner, and either an enslaved African woman or in turn perhaps a free woman of color in St. Vincent. And that cadre of women of color often became urban entrepreneurs in the slave economy. So what this doesn't show is who these people were, but because of the resources that exist now that years ago did not exist, it's possible to begin to track down large numbers of these people relatively quickly. Superficially, I grant you, but relatively quickly. And that's what we've done in the project that I was participating in for 10 to 15 years at UCL. We have a database which is front-ended like this, which is searchable and allows you to search by a number of different categories, but including, I'll come back to it, but including obviously place as one of the ways in which you can search. We're focused in looking at what we call legacy strands, and this is conceptually how we thought about what we were looking at. So we were interested not only in who the slave owners were, but what they did with their money, and in particular what they did with their money in Britain. About a third of the slave owners lived in Britain, and 2/3 lived overseas in the colonies themselves. But the slave owners who lived in Britain were the larger scale slave owners, and that was in fact borne out by the chart I just saw you. So most of the larger slave owners came to live in Britain, either because they moved here to retire here, or because they were merchants who'd lent money to slave owners, then foreclosed on the mortgages and come to be owners in that way. And we were concerned to think about these, what we called absentee owners in Britain, and what they were doing with the money that was flowing to them from slavery. So, as I say, we looked at these legacy strands. Commercial is really the whole business and financial impact. What firms were they involved in Britain? The physical legacies, what did they build? What did they use the money for? If they were building houses, either urban or country houses, or pieces of infrastructure. What were they doing politically? Because they were powerful, but not all powerful. In the end, they lost in the 1830s. They were compensated, but slavery came to an end. What were their cultural and philanthropic legacies? Very many of the things that we value most today in Britain have their origins, at least in part, in slave owners and money from slave ownership. And again, it seemed to us important to identify, and I'll come back to this in the context of one very prominent local slave related man in your neighborhood, John Julius Angerstein. The imperial legacies were about what the slave owners did, particularly after the end of slavery, as they pushed their families into the new white settler colonies in Australia, New Zealand, and Canada. We can see families who were Jamaican families giving up on Jamaica because slavery was over and going off to find new arenas in which to develop family fortunes. And then historical, perhaps that's a misnomer, but what we're describing there is the way in which slave owners and their children in the middle of the 19th century began to rewrite the history of slavery so that they became the victims of emancipation. And if you read dozens of entries, for example, in the Oxford Dictionary of National Biography, you'll come repeatedly over the kind of phrases that indicate that people were ruined by the end of slavery. So that's the way in which British families, and families of prominent people, Captain Marryat, the children's author, for example, wrote angrily about the kind of expropriation of his family through the ending of slavery, despite the compensation that he was awarded. So the database, as I said, is searchable by many dimensions. And one of the ways that you can search it is estate names. Therefore, it's possible to plug in Blackheath or Greenwich and look at what comes up. And it seemed to me that this was interesting, that firstly, there's quite a very considerable focus on Jamaica. And Jamaica represented only about 40% of British slaves. It was the biggest single slave colony, but there were others as well. But there's a strong nexus, as you can see. And in naming estates after the local area, the people who founded those estates or bought them and renamed them are expressing something fundamental about their identity, their linkages and connections to your area that we haven't tracked down in every case why it is that the slave owner reached for these as the labels. But it's clearly one way in which you can map Britain onto the colonies and the colonies onto Britain is by looking at these naming practices for the estates. And then perhaps even more striking, enslaved people who have been called in captivity by the name Greenwich. And you can see here that we found, just again by looking in the slave registers, this is not part of our database, it's part of a separate set of resources. But again, they're accessible relatively easily online if you're patient. But enslaved people who were named after your community, after your locality. And you can see that in all three cases, they've been rechristened and rebaptized, or I think this must relate to baptisms in the 1810s and the 1820s, in which their first name in captivity, Greenwich, was then replaced by a more conventional Christian name and surname through, as I say, I suspect baptism in most cases. But in the original kind of naming, alongside the many kind of Kwaminas, Cuomos that you find, which are kind of quasi-African names, and some of those were retained by the enslaved people. Others were clearly satirical. You'll find people called Napoleon and Wellington, enslaved people with those kind of names. But the naming, of course, is an extremely powerful thing, to be able to take somebody's identity away from them and replace it, and to replace it in some cases with Greenwich. So it's possible to search for Blackheath, and you can replicate this quickly enough and find the addresses for people in Blackheath or Greenwich in the database. Those entries, and we'll look at a couple in a moment, then allow you to go in more detail into the individuals. And so what I'm going to do for the remainder of the talk is really to highlight about a dozen people and then one institution that seem to me to be important in thinking about, okay, these connections are there, but what do they mean? What did they mean then, and what do they mean, if anything, today? First up, as Ben perhaps predictably, is John Julius Angerstein. And he was a key figure, as many of you know, in the insurance market in the late 18th century. And in particular, he was an art connoisseur. And his collection formed the cornerstone of the National Gallery in London. The National Gallery has now the paintings, almost all the paintings, that were bought from Angerstein's estate. He didn't give them, but his executors sold them to the nation. And that became the key platform of the National Gallery. And the historic record, if you like, the historic evidence about Angerstein has really been lost, I think, in two different ways. The first, this was actually on the National Gallery's own website, and now has been taken down because the National Gallery is not trying to disguise any of this. What it's trying to do is actually get to a proper accounting and a documentarily evidenced summary of what Angerstein's connections with slavery were. So originally, the National Gallery was saying that he was he was a large-scale slave owner, and that his income from Grenada was part of what drove his wealth. They also acknowledge, of course, the Lloyd's role. His home, of course, house, is still extant and is an important and very wonderful site. Now part of the George Steiner School. The complexity around Angerstein is very significant, however, because he was not a slave owner. He was a trustee for estates in Grenada. In other words, he had a legal responsibility and authority over estates, and he had taken that on because when he was in his insurance broking business, he had built up credit to a group of merchants who then defaulted and went bankrupt. And he was pursuing the money that they owed him for unpaid insurance premium on their ships. They weren't slave ships that were insured. They were West Indiamen that took sugar back from the colonies and took manufactured goods and plantation supplies directly from Britain to the colonies. So Angerstein was a trustee of slave estates, and he was a prime mover, as we saw, in the development of Lloyd's. But to date, at least, in the work that we've done alongside the National Gallery, we've found no evidence that he was a slave trader and no evidence that he insured slave ships. He insured, again, these West Indian merchantmen that went backwards and forwards between Britain and the Caribbean, and which, without a doubt, formed an important part of the slave economy. But again, it's clear to us that it's very important that we are precise about what his involvement was and what it wasn't. And again, there is, bad history drives out good. And I'm not saying that good history is the history that we do, but I think the good history is history that is evidenced. And the National Archives site, Exhibitions and Learning, for example, said of this house, the house and its grounds show the fabulous wealth and lifestyle of those who profited from slavery. It does, but he profited from other things as well. And again, trying to get a handle on how much of his wealth came from marine insurance is a problem. And then within that, how much of it came from the African trade or the West Indian trade is another issue. But it would appear that for the marine insurance market overall, probably about a third of its revenues flowed from the combination of the slave trade ships and the West India ships. And the West India ships were the more important. So this is complicated history, and it's not reducible to a 2 or 3 line summary, I think. And we've actually given to the National Gallery an account, which is, in the end, it's probably 24 pages, that tries to describe all the evidence that we have for the connections between Angerstein and slavery. Okay, a second figure, James Mather. Again, he illustrates the complexity and the contradictions for Britons in the 19th century. He was very well known as the MP for South Shields and a reformer. Mining and shipping safety was his thing, the design of the lifeboat. He was an MP from the 1850s onwards. But he'd married a slave owner's daughter. In the 1830s, he was one of the most regular correspondents with the Slave Commission, men who were administering this system of distributing the money that Britain was paying to the slave owners, the £20 million. And all of those letters between Mather and the Commission show him as a full modern place on Blackheath Hill. Broome Hall, again, has a complicated family history. A man called John Willett Adey was adopted by his cousin Ralph Willett and changed his name to John Willett Willett to acknowledge his cousin's primacy, I guess. You'll find Ralph Willett in the Oxford Dictionary of National Biographer as a book collector and a connoisseur. Ralph Willett, in fact, was a slave owner and left to John Willett AD in states and enslaved people in St. Kitts and land in Dorset, and a huge collection of books and pictures. John Willett was MP for New Romney. In financial difficulty by 1813. One of the sons died at Broome Hall as a lunatic, and his brother, Henry Ralph Willett, was what's called the Committee in Lunacy. In other words, he took care of his brother's estate and property, and in that capacity received slave compensation. St. Germans Place, Blackheath. Robert Metcalfe Atkinson lived here at number 6. And he was one of what's called the remainder men in the will of a slave owner called George Metcalfe. Obviously, you can see the naming practices recurring. It was a condition of the slave owner's will that Robert Metcalfe Atkinson took the middle name of Metcalfe, and the remainder man is the person who stands behind the original tenant in common. In other words, a slave owner would leave his estate for life, perhaps to his wife, and then after his wife's death, the estate would pass to a designated male, in this case, Robert Metcalfe Atkinson. And that allowed the wife, the widow, to live off the proceeds of slavery, but not to have any role in the ultimate disposition of the property. It was a form of control, obviously, beyond death. St. Luke's Churchyard in Charlton, perhaps a little bit away from the core area we're talking about. Hislop was, again, many of you know this, a British soldier, the subject of significant controversy in Britain over the killings of prisoners in war in India in the Maratha Wars. And for a time he served in the West Indies as the Lieutenant Governor of Trinidad. And when he was there, he invested in the slave economy, as many officials did, until in the 1820s it became frowned upon to do that. He owned a coffee estate in Trinidad. Trinidad estates were smaller scale. He owned 16 enslaved people in 1813. And as I said, by the mid-1820s, governors and other colonial officials, including clergymen, were discouraged from owning enslaved people by the metropolitan government. I've talked a lot about men so far, and I talked at the outset about female slave owners and their presence. And here I wanted to highlight to you Charlotte Pengilly, who's the second down here at Hyde Vale Cottages, the wife of a retired naval officer. And she appears in the compensation records as a legatee under the will of her father, a man called William Harriot, who left her £4,000 secured on his estate called Mexico, oddly enough, in St. Elizabeth in Jamaica. And you can see there's further down the page, there's a visitor 3 lines up from the bottom, a 7-year-old visitor called Edward Ferguson, born in Jamaica. So she has maintained her connections in some shape or form. This is from the 1851 census. Slavery, as I said, was abolished under the 1834 Abolition Act, but she's retained her linkages, and this presumably is a family relationship, kin, friend, whose son she's taking in. Adam Young in Vanbrugh Fields in Greenwich, we know, was a mortgagee. And in his will, which he made in 1839, he left his estate, including all my interest in a certain plantation situated in the island of Jamaica called Golden Vale, to his dear nephew, Adam Young Jr., who actually lived in Lee Road in Blackheath Park. He was an example of a British merchant who never went to Jamaica, but who lent money to slave owners there, and when they fell foul of the fluctuations in the sugar market, he stepped in and seized the estate. Again, in this, a lot of words on this slide. It's from an earlier period, 1762. but you can see that it's a lease. So there are financial structures being put on top of the enslaved people, which absentees in Britain were constructing for their benefit and for the benefit of others. Here you can see Jane Allen of Greenwich, a spinster, William Allen of Blackheath, and then others, including the master of Magdalen College, Cambridge, my alma mater, were leasing an estate and enslaved people to Peter Mackenzie and Hutchison Muir, who were paying, as you can see, significant levels of rent for the estate. So the risk here shifted to the two London merchants, and the owners, including Jane Allen of Greenwich, became rentiers, and they were receiving a fixed return, and then it was up to Mackenzie and Muir to do better than £800 or £1,200 over the lease period. John Fisher of Greenwich, again, you can see that from his will, he was providing for his wife this conventional 1/3, which was evocative of the old dower that used to be extended automatically by right to widows, but remained as a custom and practice for some time, and then 2/3 to his sons. He died and his will was proved in 1769, but we found his estate record, his probate record in Jamaica, which shows what he owned there. And this amount of money, we can again debate this. This is Jamaican currency. In sterling terms, it would have been about 2/3 of that amount. So let's say it's £15,000. But depending on what you're attempting to show, I think, what you're attempting to measure, you should multiply that up either by 100 times or more consistently, we think, 1,000 times to reflect the purchasing power that has relative to wages today. William by the Sea, it's such a wonderful name. I paused for a long time on that. A different form of involvement. He had bought an annuity in St. Vincent. In other words, again, he was not a slave owner. He lived in Britain, but he invested when a slave owner in St. Vincent wanted to raise money. The slave owner in St. Vincent sold an annuity, an amount of money payable. You know what an annuity is. Many of us with pensions know exactly what annuities are and what what the complexities of those are. But he purchased this annuity that was secured on the estate and on the enslaved people. And so if it wasn't paid, he and the other annuitants were in a position to move to take control of the estate and to attempt to secure the annuities that they had. So I've talked about individuals. I wanted to really close by moving towards institutions. Greenwich Hospital has got a complicated involvement in slavery. I think many of you know that it owned Golden Vale, an estate in Jamaica from about 1788 to 1811. It had come into that estate for a debt that was owed to it of about 55,000. I don't know the origin of that debt, but I'm going to come on and talk about another set of obligations that may reflect the same set of facts. Golden Vale was a problem for the Greenwich Hospital, and they placed it up for sale in 1802 unsuccessfully. They couldn't sell it at that point, and when it had 158 seasoned Negroes, 153 head of stock. It allegedly had losses in the end for the hospital of almost £30,000. So not a terrific outcome for the hospital. But we've found them in a different capacity in the compensation records, where the governors of Greenwich Hospital appear repeatedly in a very complicated chancery suit. And what had happened, again, as many of you probably know, is that Greenwich Hospital was entitled to receive the naval prizes that were not claimed by the seamen themselves. when British ships captured either foreign merchantmen or foreign warships, but particularly merchantmen, the captain and crew were entitled to prize money. That prize money was a big business, and there were agents who handled prize money on behalf of the crews. And two prize agents in Jamaica built up a huge debt to Greenwich Hospital because they reinvested the prize money that should have gone to Greenwich, the unclaimed prize money. They reinvested it in their business by lending it to slave owners and taking mortgages over estates. And so in the 1830s, the governors of Greenwich Hospital were trying to retrieve this money and claw it back through the Chancery suit. It covered hundreds and hundreds of enslaved people by that stage. So the hospital today, and the reason for showing it is that beyond it, you can obviously see at least one version, it changes now fast, of the financial centre, the new financial centre at Canary Wharf. And slavery permeates the City of London. It's in many, many places, but it's not always the critical stream. And one of the challenges, I think, for all of us trying to understand the impact of slavery is to work out it can't be nothing, but it also can't be everything in terms of understanding the history. David Kynaston, very well established historian of modern Britain, wrote a big history of the City of London beginning around 1800. And he began with 5 or 6 new men, exemplary men, who he saw as being signals that the world was changing and that the city was going to grow into what it became, an engine for the British economy, an engine for the global economy. 5 out of 6 of those new men were actually tied in different ways to slave economy, and Kynaston made no mention of that. I didn't know, didn't care. But nevertheless, we can demonstrate what those linkages were. Some of them are slight, some of them are more material. The City of London is, and its relationship with slavery, is to be resolved. And the Bank of England last year put out a statement which said it advisedly there was no connection between the bank and the slave system. That simply isn't correct, and that is just not right. And so they've come back, and in the next month or so, I think they've got an exhibition that deals with some of the connections that the bank did have with slavery. We talked about the National Gallery. Many of the banks in Britain, particularly what was the Royal Bank of Scotland, that had bought NatWest 20 years ago, if you were a banker in the ports in the 18th and early 19th century, you were doing business with slave traders and with West India merchants. And again, we can delineate those. And the important thing, as I say, is both to recognize those connections, but not to believe that the banks therefore owe their existence entirely to slavery. And it's a very difficult balance, I think. You have to try and quantify all the time what the connections actually are. Are they significant, or are we just playing a game of kind of gotcha when there is a connection? I think it's important to understand what those connections are and what they aren't. We are all beneficiaries of slavery, everybody who lives in this country, in my view, because the country we live in, its modernity, its beauty, its wealth, some of that is a function of our involvement in the slave economy. I think there can be no question that is true. The question is, if you like, is how much is the first question. And that debate will go on for a long time. And there is no single answer that I can give you. It differs between place and institution. But the debate is about how much. It's not about whether. It's about how much. And the system died out 200 years ago, was extinguished 200 years ago, and we're all glad that it was. But its effects live on. I mean, its effects, as I say, in some instances, the effects are favorable for us because we have institutions and things that wouldn't have existed without slave wealth. But also, of course, there are terrible, terrible effects from slavery that are still running today, the legacies particularly of racism and of underdevelopment. It's not possible to run a slave system without, in some respects, dehumanizing the enslaved people, because you can't do what you need to do to run a plantation and to extract labor by violence unless you can denominate the people to whom you're doing it as different and inferior to you. So those attitudes, without a doubt, that many of which are still running today, you can locate them, not solely, but in large measure in the dynamics of slavery. Again, you have to decide for yourselves whether you accept or not the burden that in a way I'm pushing at you, and you certainly need to decide for yourself as well. There's any so what as to what happens next and what we can collectively or individually do in response to it. But I think that what history teaches us is that it has been possible in the past for men and women to change things, to overthrow what had been taken up to then as the natural order of things. And that's why I don't minimize the abolition of slavery and of the slave trade and then of slavery by Britain, by ordinary people in Britain, by through their resistance, by politicians in Britain. We did change things. And there's an argument, I think, that we may need to change some more things again in a very complicated world, and a world that obviously in the last month or so has become a great deal more complicated and difficult. That period will pass, and I think we'll then be facing again some of the issues that really we've parked for the time being. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Nick.
Yes, yes, I think that was a very thought-provoking talk. I thought, as I said, I've heard it before, and again, it was new, and again, shall be thinking about it. We have some chats, don't we? I saw. Chats.
Yes, shall I just run through the list?
Yes, Jonathan, yes, please.
Comments and questions, and I know that Mary Bright's got her hand up as well, so I will get to you, Mary, I promise. The first comment was from Sue Davis, who asked if she could actually make a contribution herself. Sue, would you like to unmute and speak?
I certainly would. I would also like to see myself, because I want to hold something up. What you said, Nick, at the beginning of this was that you were coming to find out what we might know about our own area. And I have to say, Deptford is adjacent to both Greenwich and Blackheath. We have produced, if you can see this, in the last month, we have had this is a map that we have done of our area, so that on our streets, in our institutions, in our businesses, we have tried to own the legacy that we have found on this subject. And here is the description of it. We do not take this lightly. These are available, will be available for everybody to have. And I suppose the question of, we would love to get involved in some kind of discussion about the deeper implications in our schools and so on, which we know exist, largely through South Africa, through the South Sea Company, but mosaf.org.uk will give it. So it's a campaign for a museum of slavery and freedom in London on our bank of the River Thames, which is it's where the first ever English slaver left from, John Hawkins. It was where Equiano was trafficked. There are a lot of, all of which is actually in this book, in our map. But the question I wanted to ask you is it possible to give an overarching figure of the percentage of London's commerce which was involved in the trade or allied industries by, say, the end of the 18th century, or any other period when slaving was prolific? And I suppose I am thinking of London here, because we are a campaign for London.
Yeah. It's a simple question, and there should, of course, be not a simple question, but it's a straightforward question, and there should be a straightforward answer. But there isn't. As I say, I think that my conclusion has been that there isn't a single number that we could or should use. We have to look at each of the individual subcomponents of the economy to be precise and specific about what they were doing. you can argue, of course, that if you put them all together, you should have a result arithmetically that will drop out. But we can't, I think, analyze enough segments of the economy closely enough. As I said, in the case of marine insurance, I think we can be pretty precise about this 33 to 40% number. That's likely to be lower in the case of other trades. Clearly, the entire sugar business is 100% slave related for a long period of time. So there isn't a single figure, but in key areas of the economy, we can measure or begin to get some kind of handle on what that figure is. It's very rarely going to be a majority, I think, but it's going to be
Sorry, I'm sorry. It's very rarely going to be a majority.
Yeah, it's going to be a significant minority in many significant cases, is my view. And I'm thrilled about the depth of work that you've done in the map. I don't know where people can get it from, Sue, but it looks like a very wonderful piece of work. I know, obviously, Joan Animardo had some early history that was one of the first people to say, look at this, here's something that we need to be mindful of. And she's obviously continued over decades doing this kind of work.
And she is absolutely a star as far as we're concerned.
Yeah, and us too, Yeah, okay.
The next comments and questions came from Mary Mills. Would you like to speak now, Mary?
Well, I'm sort of sitting here muttering about a number of things, but to thank Sue and to say that we have somebody from the museum coming in a couple of months' time to talk about their work to Greenwich industrial history. I'm a bit concerned about Angerstein because we have the Angerstein Railway, which of course is built by a younger generation of Angersteins, and I'd be quite interested in knowing if how much was inherited by the family, although that may never be possible to know. And the other thing is about sourcing and raw materials. That a lot of Greenwich industry obviously is using raw materials from all over, not sugar. I mean, sugar seems to be something we don't really have, except very much later 20th century, which is irrelevant to this. A lot of rubber and this sort of thing, copper from South America and so on. So it's a bit sort of general and muddled, but I would like to know about Angerstein's children and what they inherited, because they built a lot of things here.
Yeah, and I'm pretty clear that John Angerstein, I think oldest son, maybe only son, certainly oldest son, but was the prime beneficiary under the will of John Julius. So, whatever John Julius has accumulated, whatever portion of that we can attribute to kind of the slave component would have been transmitted to the next generation. So, that connection is by no means a trivial one. And I think particularly the railways throughout Britain, obviously they were funded in the 1840s and 1850s, so it's after the end of slavery. But we've done a little bit of work that shows that in some railways there are lots and lots of former slave owners who are slave shareholders, and in other railways there are none at all. So again, it's this picture of uneven development. The Angerstein railway connection in southeast London is one that I wasn't aware of, and is an important one.
Very idiosyncratic. It's a line which is quite short. It's only ever been used as private goods line.
Is that right?
And it was, as far as I'm aware, fully funded by John Angerstein, who built it on his own land. It's still running. It still takes a lot of heavy freight.
Is that right? Yeah. For your second question, and it's an important point you make, our focus is on slavery, and therefore it's on primarily the Caribbean, the American colonies. The larger question for us in Britain now is not only about slavery, it's about colonialism and about our impact globally in the world. So the labor systems certainly in the rubber plantations in the Far East were not formerly, I'm sure, chattel slavery, but they would have been indentured labor, as you say, where, from the point of view of the individual concerned, there was a difference, but it'd be very hard to point to that difference in the 7 or 10 years of their indenture. It's another form of coerced labor, without a doubt. Copper from South America would have been slave derived from Brazil all the way through the 19th century. Yeah, you're absolutely right to highlight, firstly, that slavery and freedom are not necessarily binaries. There's a whole spectrum of coercive labor practices that, I think argue would slavery is kind of discontinuity at one end of that spectrum, but along the spectrum there's other things. The indentured servitude is a form of exploitation that has a very significant impact, of course, on the people who are indentured. And right, a colonial system, as Britain and France and other nations established, depends on the shipping of raw materials from all around the world for the benefit of the metropolitan society. So we benefited not only from slavery but from the wider colonial framework.
Okay, can I come to Mary Bright then? Mary?
Yes, thank you. Thank you so much, Nick. That was really, really fascinating. I'm a trustee at a little, I say it's a castle, but it's actually a single room per floor at the top of Shooter's Hill, which you may or may not know runs out of Greenwich, across Blackheath, and then it's where the land rises out of Greenwich. And Sevendrug Castle was built in 1784 by a woman called Lady James, who was the widow of Sir William James of the East India Company. And we've been looking at the castle, we've been looking a lot into exactly what the origins of the wealth that built that castle, because, well, we historically anyway like to know, but we'd like to be clear with our visitors. And to what extent was the East India Company actually involved in active slave ownership, or were they simply trade, if you like, a vehicle? Sir William James, I should say, by the way, was a commodore in the East India Company. The reason that the castle is called Sevendrug is because it's named after the Battle of Suvarnadurg, which was it was actually part of the Maratha uprisings, and he fought off what used to be called pirates. I think we might actually not call them pirates now.
Possibly
I think
not.
they might have been patriots rather than pirates. But my question was about the East India Company and the relationship to slavery.
Okay, again, I think a reasonably complicated response. The first thing I think to say is that there were obviously forms of slavery, domestic slavery, particularly in India, throughout the period of the East India Company's involvement. And the British government could never quite get its head around how to deal with that form of slavery. The West Indian slave owners pointed to the East Indies and said, look, you're doing the same thing there as we're doing in the Caribbean. And the people in East India said, no, you don't understand. These are different, the forms of engagement that we have. So rather than abolishing slavery in India at the same time as abolishing it in the Caribbean, the British government delegalized slavery in the 1840s. In other words, they said you could no longer go to courts in India to enforce discipline or actions on enslaved people. But effectively, it was a shrugging of the shoulders over the complexities of Indian practices in the subcontinent. The East India Company, as you know, was never a kind of it never colonized India in the same way. It didn't seize the land and expropriate the land. It acted as a kind of succubus on top of an existing sophisticated society and system and pulled revenues out of it in a parasitic fashion. So that would be the second observation. So that when people came from the East India Company back to Britain, they very rarely left property in India. There was nothing really that they did. That their problem was to get the money out, and there were very elaborate ways in which they brought home the earnings that they had. They try and ship it obviously as as golden pearls. But if they couldn't do that, they'd have to find ways in which they could buy cargoes of stuff and ship it commercially. And in the early days of British slavery, the East India Company was a relatively active participant, or directors of the East India Company, I should say more accurately, were participants in the slave trade itself. So there are traces of it back at the end of slavery in Mauritius, where Britain was the imperial power. Many East India merchants are in Mauritius as slave owners and mortgagees by the end of slavery. But it's a complicated picture, and there are people certainly more equipped than me to help understand those nexuses. So if you are in need of or want to consult, there's a very eminent historian at UCL called Margot Finn, who is an East India Company specialist and has been working for 20 or 30 years on the East India Company. I'm happy to put you in touch with her.
Brilliant, thank you so much. We would very much like that, because there've been various projects at the castle, but they have been relatively amateur. So we would like to, engage. I mean, I've been reading up with some of William Dalrymple's work on the East India Company, which is interesting. But no, that would be marvelous. And in fact, if I can perhaps somehow make contact with you about that, that would be brilliant. Thank you. But one of the arguments about Sevendrug is that actually Lady James was in her own right very wealthy. So of course, there's always the kind of get out of jail card free that people say, well, she had lots of money anyway, so the castle probably wasn't really East India Company money. Well, it was actually, and it was actually filled with loot that he brought back. So
yeah, very interesting. All right, well, perhaps through Helma we can just exchange emails and then
thank you.
Yeah,
thank you. David Walker had a question.
Yes, thank you. Yes, fascinating talk, Nick. Thanks very much. I've actually got two questions, one of which I think should be fairly simple and the other maybe less so. On your map, the line to America, North America, is very thin. And yet must have been hundreds of thousands of slaves on the sugar plantations of American South. That's my first question. My second question is, where do you stand on reparations?
Okay, on the first question, you're absolutely right. I'm not sure whether I should put it back up, but let me try and do that. It's a striking thing, David, that you picked up, I think, from that. I'm always also struck by it. What it reflects is two things. Firstly, in addition, I think, to the direct slave trade in North America, there was also very significant smuggling of enslaved people up from Cuba and San Domingue and Jamaica into the colonies of the Southern American colonies, all the way through, that in this schematic is hidden because it treats the port of delivery as being the first stop, if you like, Cuba or Jamaica. Mm. But if you look at the comparison, as you say, between the Portuguese trade to Brazil, which was the biggest single component of the slave trade, and then this rather slender arrow going up to North America, it is a very, very striking thing. And it reflects, or what happened in the American colonies is almost unique in the Caribbean, in the history of the slave trade, because the enslaved populations in America reproduced themselves and expanded. In other words, live births outweighed deaths consistently, and so the enslaved population, about 500,000 people, were moved in this slave trade, but the population of enslaved people on the eve of the Civil War was something like 4 to 5 million.
All right, wow.
So, by contrast, we shipped 3 million people into the British colonies, and at the end of slavery, there were around 700,000 people there. So you can see that there was a catastrophic demographic experience in the British Caribbean that was reflected also in the French experience. And in North America, it was a completely different picture. As I say, the enslaved population grew organically as well as by new shipments until 1808. Yeah. And in the end, the difference, I think, is sugar. Growing sugar was an absolutely lethal environment for enslaved people. The work patterns, particularly in crop time, and crop time lasted for some months, but in that harvest period, people were working basically 24 hours a day. And the nutritional levels were very low, and the treatment of pregnant women was not only rudimentary, but actually kind of diametrically opposed to their ability to reproduce. The British slave owners for many years preferred to buy new enslaved people rather than have the burden of raising children into slavery. So a completely different demographic experience. And of course, the legacies of slavery in the US, because slavery was right there, right in the heart of the society, are different than they are in Britain. Not easier, not more difficult perhaps, but they are different than the legacies here. But their demographic experience is completely different. So on your second question on reparations, on my position that there are different forms of reparation, I think, that depends whether you're talking about individual firms or families or about societies. And those are sometimes treated as competing projects. But I think that every firm and family who benefited from slavery are now constrained. They have no choice, but in some way to confront their past. 20 years ago, that wasn't the case, but now it's not possible to just flick away this problem. And so firms and institutions are trying to work out themselves how to make reparation for their historic involvement. And who's to say what reparation should be? It certainly isn't me. And maybe it certainly isn't the firm that's involved who should define what the extent and form should be, but that's how it's starting. And so, firms need to find negotiating partners who can help them through this process. I think there's no point, at least to me, there's no point in saying, guess what, we've set up a scholarship at Oxford for ... and expect and believe that that's the end of the process. It can't be, and there will be a pushback at some point. So it has to be done collaboratively. And then the question is, who is your collaborator? So I think there are practical difficulties for firms and families, but they'll sort through them. At a national level, there's a movement in the Caribbean that is more or less still born for reparations from CARICOM, which is the kind of equivalent trading group. It's like an old EFTA trading group. It's not an integrated market. And they've asked the British and the French and the Dutch governments to commit to a program of reparation. And the British and Dutch and French governments have said, absolutely not. There's no basis for this. Take us to court if you can. And so far, nobody's found the legal fulcrum. But that legal fulcrum is only it's a political device, or it's a device to open a political discussion. And we won't have that political discussion in this country for a while, I think. There needs to be a consensus built in the wider society that this is something that matters. The Labour Party very briefly had as a programmatic commitment that they would bring together a national commission on slavery. And that, I think, is the way that we'll have to do it in the end, is to have some form of combined effort that is cross-party, in which everybody can get together and say, okay, what is the evidence? What isn't the evidence? And then we can debate the so what's. But at least let's have some agreement about what the basic history is. Because at the moment, as I said, you've got historians who have no interest in history, in slavery, and its noise is off from their point of view. They don't care. And there are other people, maybe like me, who think slavery is fundamental. But I need to demonstrate that through the evidence. And until there's some meeting of those minds, and that can happen in a political process that brings in all the different constituencies, then there won't be any progress on reparations as a government-to-government matter.
Thank you.
There were just a couple more comments, if I can refer to them. There was one other question about reparations. Marika, does that answer your question? I think we must have lost Marika then. Judith Hibbert had a question about naval involvement.
Hi, yes, I am part of MOSAF, as well, Museum of Slave and Freedom. And I just wanted to find out, is there any evidence to show the naval involvement with the slave trade? We hear about the abolishment. Is there any evidence to sort of show that they were part of the slave trade?
The short answer and the honest answer is I don't know. I don't know enough about the Navy to be authoritative about that in the 18th century. My impression is that, well, I do know a little bit more. The Navy is absolutely essential in the West India trade, in bringing goods back from the Caribbean to Britain. And this is the way that obviously wealth and money transfers. Without the Navy, that could not happen. Because in wartime, those ships are incredibly vulnerable. And so the convoy system involves bringing together armed naval vessels and lots of merchant ships, and then moving them across at a single go. And if the convoy was lost, that was a big, big blow to the city of London, to the merchants involved. So the Navy is central to the security of the Caribbean islands, the security of the West India merchants, bringing the wealth back to Britain. But as far as the slave trade is concerned, I think that, and this is really beyond my capability, my knowledge, but in the early days of the slave trade, the intermingling of the state and the Navy and the Royal African Company is quite significant. Then in the 18th century, the heyday of the slave trade, I don't think that the Navy is involved in the shipping of enslaved people.
Okay, and I think Sue had another question that she wanted to put, if there's no more. Sue?
Shall I actually say it? I'm sorry.
Yes, would you like to?
I don't mean to take up everybody's time, but I'm interested because of John Evelyn, the diarist, being on our patch, and we know that he was involved in setting up the hospital, and also that he owned Royal African Company shares, and that he was a member of the plantation, Charles II's plantation committee, and was involved in this over decades. Have you done sufficient study of the kind of background of the Greenwich Hospital to know whether he was involved in getting the hospital to invest in the plantations system in some way?
On that specific question, the answer is no, I haven't done the work. And the involvement of the hospital and plantations I was describing comes much, much later, obviously, than John Evelyn. I'm involved in another project at the moment that's looking at the shareholders of, amongst other things, at the shareholders of the Royal African Company. So Evelyn will certainly be part and parcel of that. And the connection with Greenwich Hospital is one that I'll try and make sure that we don't lose sight of as we go forward and look at things.
Thank you. And it would be wonderful for us to, because the RAC Africa Company seems to have one book, KG Davies or something or other, and it seems like we really need to, for evidence-based work, which is what ours is, we need to have as much information about the Royal Africa Company as possible.
We're working to produce a new database that will be similar to LBS. LBS is obviously about slave owners. This would be about the slave trade, but it would include the shareholders in the Royal African Company as being, so it would be a biographical dictionary that would allow you again to do the same kind of work that you can do with the LBS.
Absolutely fantastic.
So we're a couple of years away from having that launched, but Will Pettigrew, who's leading that project, is one of the kind of new modern historians who are intending to kind of supplement and go beyond Davis's work.
Thank you.
Thank you, Nick. Those are all the questions that have been sent through. Thank you.
Okay, well, thank you.
Well, thank you very much. Fantastic.
Thank you.
Helma?
You're on mute, Helma.
Yes, thank you very much, Nick. That was really brilliant, and it was different from what you did a year ago. So it's equally thought-provoking. So I could hear it again, actually, in a year's time. So But thank you very much for doing that. I mean, very much appreciated. And we've had lots and lots of questions, which is always a very good sign, and lots of discussion. So a huge thank you from both the Greenwich Society and the Blackheath Society.
Well, thank you for the chance. And what it's done predictably in the Q&A is to demonstrate to me what I knew would be the case, which is that there's lots and lots of work being done by lots and lots of people on this issue and cognate issues. That means that instead of it, remaining as a bitter fight among a handful of academics, that there's actually a community and social dimension to this, which is critical. So all that work that is being done locally is what in the end is going to drive the changes that we need in the way that we think about about history. It's not going to be top down. It's going to be, as I say, community led.
Exactly, and maybe we should do it again in a couple of years to see, what progress has been made. That would be really good. Also in Deptford and everything. So yeah, we'll keep it. We'll keep thinking about it, I think.
All right. Well, thank you again.
Thank you very much. Bye, everybody. Thank you for joining.